So have British universities become combative with lad culture? Today, debating this topic, I'm pleased to welcome Milo Yiannopoulos, broadcaster and columnist, and Dr. Theodore Koulouris, a senior lecturer in media studies and critical theory. So welcome. So firstly, Milo, how would you describe a lad?
Well, I think in this debate, lad culture is used to mean boys who have a particular set of boisterous behaviours that some people think are causing problems for women, or maybe difficult for women to relate to or engage with. But really it's, I would just describe it as young men letting off steam in an entirely appropriate and healthy way.
Okay, and Theo, what would you say to that?
It is an interesting answer. I would suggest, however, that it is a complex cultural phenomenon which has, in my view, rather deep sociocultural and political roots. And I would, if you didn't mind, I mean, I'd like a bit more of an explanation as what you mean by boisterous.
Sure. Well, I think in a wider context of the way that boys are being treated in society and education generally, men of my generation didn't experience any sort of structural disadvantage by being men. In fact, society has been architected the other way around for really quite a long time. But society is changing and changing very quickly. I don't think lad culture and boisterousness is a particularly complicated phenomenon. I think it's very simple. It's happened, since there have been men. Men have let off steam in adolescence. It's very straightforward, really. That while men are growing up in school, being increasingly whacked on Adderall and Ritalin and modafinil in American schools because they're held up to feminine standards of behaviour. If they let off steam or tear around or go a bit nuts, kind of getting that energy out of their systems, as all young boys have to as they're finding out, what it means to be a man and how to deal with this sort of excessive energy and all the rest of it. They're increasingly, as I say, being diagnosed according to feminine standards of behaviour. That's not normal. It's very damaging to men's psychology, and ultimately damaging to women too, because these men grow up becoming the sort of men that women don't want to marry.
Okay, Theo, would you then say that lad culture is something to be concerned about?
Well, if we agree that Luddism can be considered, how can I put it, an extreme form of masculinity, or one aspect of a multiple context or multiple concept that we call masculinity, if it is an extreme construct of it, then of course we should be worried. But again, Milo, I mean, what is it? I mean, that men do or should do in order to feel what do you mean by letting off steam? I mean, I let off steam when I was younger. I can't let off any steam at the moment. But when I was
it's
younger,
harder as you get older, right?
I did let off steam, but I was never offensive. I never sort of. I was never presumptuous. I never considered it to be my right to, more or less, force women to behave in a certain way, so to speak, or treat women.
I don't think this debate's actually about women at all. I don't think it has much to do with women, and I think women injecting themselves into it is part of the problem. Boys let off steam in a certain way. We hear constantly from feminists and other minorities about the safe spaces that they need in order to have debate or simply exist unworried from outside influences, and able to just do what they want and behave what they want. Lad culture is actually a safe space of its own and its own kind. It's a very poorly understood one, like forum culture and chan culture on the internet, which is also a version of a safe space. It's just a safe space for men. Now that concept sounds a little weird to us. Or why would a straight white male need a safe space at all? Don't they run the world? And until very recently they did. But things are changing quite quickly, and it's left some young men feeling quite disorientated. For example, women under 30 in the UK and the US now earn more for the same work in jobs. Boys are, as many young men feel, and again, it's not something that my generation necessarily experienced, but lots of young men feel as though the world of work and the world of education is engineered against them. There are programs for women, there are scholarships for women, there are special quotas for women even in some companies, and men don't find that to be particularly fair. So seeing all of this in context, I think, is important. Men need their own safe spaces too. They need an environment in which they can as you let off steam, and by let off steam, yeah, I mean be loud, get drunk, play sports, and none of these things are intrinsically offensive. I think you have an extraordinarily broad definition of offensive if you find that to be difficult, problematic.
I agree with you entirely. What's wrong with being boisterous and getting drunk and letting off steam? But when that sort of imposes on women's understanding of themselves and
how does it?
Well, I mean, how can I put it? I mean, I could be graphic if you like, but when in a pub, you've got drunk young men, and mind you, I'm not putting myself out of this. I used to do it too when I was younger, but not, as I said, I wasn't offensive, but when there is a situation in which a man considers it his right, a young man considers it his right to more or less presume that a woman is there for his pleasure and his pleasure alone, then whether there's the problem. I mean, I would
agree with you entirely. I simply don't think that's what's happening. I think the view that the picture you're painting is 20 years out of date. My experience writing on this subject and looking into it and speaking to young men over the last couple of years paints an entirely different picture. It paints a picture of men who are very worried about approaching women. They're worried about being laughed at, about being branded creepy, about being, even in extreme cases, accused of being rapists or potential rapists. Men now have to go to university and join compulsory consent classes. The underlying sort of background to which is you're all potential rapists. My experience actually has been that it's precisely the opposite is the case. And lad culture, this retreat into alcohol in the company of other men, is a response to that. If lad culture is getting worse, it's partly as a result of the messages that men have been sent for a decade, perhaps 2 decades, that they are all dangerous potential rapists, and the sorts of things that you're suggesting, that boys just being boys are somehow negatively affecting women, is partly the result, is part of the problem here.
I'm not suggesting that at all, but I'll because you said a couple of things that were interesting just now. You said that white men were running the world. I mean, who's running the world now?
What I said precisely was that things are changing very quickly, and that they started changing in the last 10 years very fast. And it's a generational change. Men and women under 30, for example, now, as I mentioned, earning more for the same work in the UK and the US. That is a huge change, and it's a change that's happened very recently. So sure, perhaps in most positions of power, all the rest of it,
I'm not familiar. I mean, I'd like to see some data for the fact that women under 30 and more now in some cases, because
in all cases for the same work. It's not a particularly contested statistic, but I'm very happy to send it to you.
I've got the gender equality report of last year's, that was commissioned in the UK. The UK at the moment is, the study was carried along 4 criteria, which was political empowerment, educational attainment, economic participation, and health and survival between men and women. The UK at the moment comes, mind you, the UK is one of the 8th richest nations in the world, and out of 136 countries, the UK is 29th when it comes to political empowerment, 31st when it comes to educational attainment, 35th when it comes to economic participation, and 92nd when it comes to health and survival of women. That is below Cuba, Lesotho, and South Africa, which is an extremely
maybe we should swap jobs, because they're all very good headline-grabbing journalistic nuggets from the report.
No, they're not journalistic.
You've selected them in a very very journalistic fashion, so you've done a good job. You should be a headline writer. But the point is that many of these reports tend to fall apart on closer scrutiny. For example, we're constantly hearing about the wage gap, which I'm sure was a large part of many of these reports. We have a specific one you're talking about. The gender gap is constantly mentioned. We said that women earn, depending on whose figures you believe, 77, 82, even 68 cents to the dollar, pence to the pound on what men earn. But what these things don't take into account is the different life choices that women make, and the different choices that women make in work. Women, for example, even women who don't have children, choose to work fewer hours, take longer holidays, and don't earn as much for their firms. They don't want to work as hard. They don't perhaps have that competitive, autistic, obsessive streak that men have. And as a result, they're compensated accordingly. Now, obviously, everyone that believes that if you're, somebody who's struggling on a low-paid job, that a woman should be paid the same as a man. But in those professions, which skew the statistics quite significantly and quite dramatically, where performance-related pay comes into it, and particularly taking into account simply the different life choices women make, that gap narrows to a penny. And so many of these reports are based on these sorts of memes that get reported. Last month, Obama said it, about rape on campus, a totally discredited statistic that seems to get worse every time you hear it, with no basis in fact.
Okay, so bringing this back to the university then, the National Union of Students defines lad culture as sexist, misogynistic and homophobic. At its extremes, rape-supportive attitudes, sexual harassment and violence. So what would you say to that?
What's a
definition?
rape-supportive attitude? No one supports rape. It's ridiculous. I mean, look, the NUS is famously one of the most left-wing organisations in the country. They support every wacky, crazy idea that comes along. In the last NUS Women's Conference, they said that they passed a motion saying black men should stop that gay men should stop appropriating black female culture. The NUS is not, what the NUS defines lad culture is really doesn't interest me, because if they do know the reality of what's going on campus, they deliberately misrepresent it for political ends. And, frankly, I think we can do a little bit better in our authorities.
Okay.
But why do you call it a wacky lefty?
Well, passing a motion saying that they were going to actively work to stop gay men from appropriating black female culture is wacky. It's wacky.
In what way is it lefty? It may be wacky, but in what way?
Well, because
is
it's
it
wrapped up in these sort of tired identity politics of the 60s and 70s that the left loves so much.
I agree with you.
This intolerance Olympics, the oppression Olympics, the privileged nonsense that really should have died out in the 60s and 70s, but which for some reason is still with us, but almost exclusively on the page of the Guardian and in places like the NUS.
I think would be more. It would require revealing to refer to one of your writings here, the Sexodus, which
Yep.
I read on. Is it on Brightmart?
Yeah, Brightmart.
Yeah. I mean, what I was astounded by two things. First of all, it's probity. It's extremely sort of probing. On the other hand, I thought it was extremely sort of misplaced, and its conclusions are completely shaky. I mean, I would argue, for instance, this chap Rupert, that you perhaps interviewed, German guy Rupert. I mean, what in the first paragraph he mentions meaningful retirement. There's no meaningful retirement for men, yes, for young men. There's no prospects of unemployment, and there's extreme poverty. Now, in your article, instead of actually sort of building a rather coherent critique of who's to blame for these things, you actually attack the radical feminists, not those who have misappropriated, people's wages, not those who, instead of actually serving people's interests, bailed out banks and then transferred public debts onto private debts, or private debts onto the public, the shoulders of the people. So to speak.
Yeah, I think I know what you're doing with that.
But the radical feminists, and then you go on to use Camille Paglia, who she's a very famous scholar, but she has been nothing short of derided by sort of how can I put it, scholars who are more or less serious. I mean, she's a big name undoubtedly, but that does not mean that in any way she's a biological determinist who out biologizes Freud himself, if you like, and suggests that everything boils down to biology. And I'm sure that I don't know whether you agree, whether biology is destiny. I mean, that's a ridiculous sort of claim.
Well, a critical theorist professor would say so. I mean, first of all, I think that Camille Paglia, who is one of the foremost feminist academics of her generation, she's certainly she and people like Christina Hoff Sommers describe themselves as dissidents because they speak against a consensus which has become very unhealthy, ossified. In fact, the feminist establishment, which is and some feminists. Sort of tenets of faith, like campus rape statistics, is precisely the reason I go after these people, because their crazy, unsubstantiated nonsense becomes government policy. That's where the bad laws are coming from. I would argue that's where the laws come. That's where the laws. Well, if you're coming from a position, of criticising the sort of authorities and structures that have given rise to imbalance in favour of men. You would have been right until really recently. You would have been right.
How recently?
But within a generation. And this is the point of my article.
20 years.
This is the point of my article.
So when I was a kid, for instance, because I grew up in the very late 90s, I suppose.
Well, as I said earlier, our generation probably didn't experience it. And to say that men were structurally disadvantaged, or that society was architected against them for anyone of our age would be ridiculous. But it isn't ridiculous anymore. And young men, with some justification, feel as though society is beginning to be engineered against them. I think the purpose of that piece was to examine where some of these problems have come from, and they primarily come from feminists who repeat these memes about campus rape, these memes about wage inequality, none of which are really true. And most people, instinctively know are not true, which is why so few women now identify as feminists, fewer than 1 in 5.
Yeah.
So the purpose of the piece, to answer the 2 points you make, the purpose of the piece in the first place is to lay some of the blame for the breakdown of relations between the sexes, yes, at radical feminism, which is where I think that blame belongs. And many feminists, not just people like Camille Paglia, who of course you would consider an antichrist, but many feminist professors have come out in the last couple of months saying that some of these tenets of the left, identity politics and the silencing and the no platform and all this kind of stuff, all of which feeds in to the sorts of things that disadvantage men just in the last generation, have gone a little too far on campuses.
I agree with you that identity politics has gone a bit too far, but the problem is not to be found with radical feminists. In my view, it has to be found with total and utter abdication of public discourse when it comes to issues of class. The problems that you quote Rupert, in terms of us saying, meaningful retirement, employment, poverty, and so on, have nothing to do with radical feminists. The fact that men, I read a bit further down that who commit suicide and are forced to actually take themselves out of society at large, are not driven by radical feminists or because they cannot talk to girls in clubs. They're driven because there are no prospects out there. And the reason because there are no prospects out there is because there's been a massive onslaught of neoliberalism
I think that takes us outside the scope of the discussion at the moment. What I was just seeking to establish is that we're perhaps one of the few things that might keep men in society, which is, love of a good woman, as it were.
Yeah.
That relationships are being denied to them as well, as a result, I think, of the legacy of the last 50 years.
I'll just say this, and then we can take it back.
It's interesting
to
that you
said.
mentioned class, because what strikes me when you talk about, I was never offensive, I never behaved like this, and then you have a go at lads and boisterousness. What I'm hearing is a middle class university professor sneering at working class behaviours.
No, you're being presumptuous.
Well, that's what I'm hearing, because it's
no.
interesting you say this, because what keeps coming up, in my research and when I talk to people about this, is not that it's a boy-girl thing or a left-right thing or a libertarian versus authoritarian thing. This is a class war. There's a certain kind of person, and it is always reflected in the very solidly middle-class background feminist academics.
What would you say to that?
Well, I want to say that just this thing, that was a presumptuous thing. I do not come from a middle-class background. I come from a very working-class background and came to the UK to study and result in my present position. But I think you would do, the public a great service if you were to employ your admittedly probing powers into issues that I just mentioned, issues of class, issues of poverty. Why is it that at the moment, Britain scores so low when it comes to the equality index, for instance, the latest
I need to know specific claims in that, because the vast majority of received wisdom in those reports from which the ratings are derived simply break down on the most cursory of examination. So I'd have to think about that. I'm grateful for your professional recommendations. I'm lucky enough to have graduated and not necessarily need to follow them. I think we should talk more about class, because I think what's happening here, you may come from a working class background, as by some definitions I probably do, but you're not working class now. And what I hear when people say this kind of stuff is a sort of turning up of the nose and a sort of, oh God, how can they behave like that? Which you were sort of at pains to do about three times. Well, I let off steam, but I wasn't boisterous, and I wasn't seeking to distance yourself from those kinds of behaviours in which there is no shame. There is no shame in wanting to have sex with sexy women. There's no shame in wanting to get drunk on a Friday night.
But
there's no shame in being loud. There's no shame in making a mess on a Friday night.
Listen,
and you spoke as if there were. And I find it very interesting.
Milo, those who are the most boisterous of them all are the upper class delinquents.
They're just the ones you hear about. They're just the ones you hear about. How many people are actually in the Bullingdon Club? Compare that to what happens on the high streets of
Oxbridge. Is not just Bullingdon Club.
What you just said is the people who behave like that most are, for want of a better word, privileged people. They're not. It's just they're the ones you hear about. Go out to the streets of Cardiff or Newcastle or Liverpool. It's the same behaviour. Everybody does it. It's just that they're the people who get reported about because it's newsworthy. I think it's a ridiculous statement to say that the people who are most guilty of it, the people with privilege, they're the people least guilty of it. Middle class kids, if if they have no other defining characteristic, it is timidity. It's just the loudest of the middle class and the loudest of the upper class who get reported on it because it's a sexy reporting subject. The vast majority of this behaviour happens to the working classes.
I really didn't. I mean, I would really like to ask you. I mean, do you have any female friends and who would actually say to you what they would like? Any women who would actually say, what kind of behaviour would be permissible? If you could just define the parameters a bit. I mean, what kind of behaviour would be permissible and not? What does a woman have to do in a club, for instance, in order to feel not safe? In other words, let's say somebody is being boisterous in a club. Yes, I love the word boisterous, by the way. So, at what point does that young man become offensive? In your estimation?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I'm guessing that you would draw the line sooner than I would. I always go back to this great debate on Newsnight between the woman whose name I've forgotten, unfortunately, who set up the Everyday Sexism Project, which is typical of the sort of ridiculous misandrist miniaturism of modern feminism. Totally absurd, mostly fictitious complaints from women about men, for the most part, simply being men. She's a typical example of what I'd call, problematic.
So you think there's a misandry, that these women hate men?
We've got ourselves into a situation where lesbianic third-wave feminists and gay guys are having a debate about how men and women should interact. Why am I even here? The reason I'm not here is that men get fired for having this sort of discussion. Men aren't allowed to talk like this. Men aren't allowed to say these things. When I went on BBC and feminists said, we're talking about women and you're not allowed to have a voice in this, and I said, well, now we're talking about men, so maybe you'd like to pop down.
These are not helpful statements. I agree with you.
No, but what I was trying to do was demonstrate how ridiculous it is when feminists say only women can talk about these issues, but they also want to talk about men's issues, and they are horrified when any man suggests that they might want their own space. I don't know. And I guess it depends on the circumstances, the context, and the boy and girl involved, what specific things would be considered to be going too far in a nightclub. What I do know is that there are more unhappy single women than ever before. There are more unhappy single men than ever before. And in this article, and I think in some of the stuff that I've written and the broadcasting I've done recently, I've tried to explain why feminism with the best of intentions has probably gone off the rails slightly and has resulted in bad outcomes for men and women.
Okay, sorry, Milo. So from our interview with Martin Dobney, he described Britain as a nation that's becoming publicly anti-bloke. Do you believe that men are in a crisis? What's your opinion on that?
I don't think society is anti-men. It may get there pretty soon. I do think it's anti-bloke, and I think it's a shame because what we really talk about with blokes and blokishness is sort of men in their unreconstructed, purist form without the sort of dressing up of polite society. There's not really very much wrong with that. There's not much of it on TV, I don't think. And when there is, there's huge outpourings of support, like Jeremy Clarkson, who had 1 million signatures before even anyone knew what had happened, saying, keep him on Top Gear. It took No More Page 3 2 years to get 250,000 signatures. It took Jeremy Clarkson 2 days to get the same amount, and then it quickly went up to 1 million. There was an enormous sort of, if you like, a silenced majority on these sorts of issues.
Theo, what would you say?
What was the question? Sorry, I was just laughing at the unreconstructed sort of archetypal masculinity kind of thing.
Do you think that young men are in a crisis, or what would you say?
I don't think young men are in crisis. I think young people are in crisis. Be it men and women. I mean, university higher education has been corporatized. We have to work more hours for less money. You probably have to work until you're 70, to get a decent pension. And I think we're in a crisis, but not the kind of crisis that Milo. And certainly I disagree with Milo categorically. It is the fault of radical feminism that does that.
I didn't seek to lay the blame for the whole thing on feminism. I said it's one aspect of the breakdown in relations between men and women. I wasn't really speaking about the wider economic issues, which I think is probably outside the scope of the debate today. I know that you seem very keen to talk about that, but that's not really what we're here to discuss. We may find some common ground on that subject, but it's not really what the article was about. I'm speaking strictly about the breakdown in relationships and in relations between the sexes, which I think has demonstrably got much worse. I think we're in a a gender crisis, or we're in a crisis of sexuality, in a crisis of sexual relations, like we haven't seen for 40 or 50 years.
Okay, Theo, would you say that there was a narrative on British campuses that lad culture was a problem?
Well, certainly. I mean, there are studies. I mean, much to my shame, I haven't sort of read many, and I haven't been within circles that such things have been alleged or sort of supported in any way. However, if you've got studies that are produced, I mean, this one was by the National Union of Students that Milo doesn't like very much, and Sussex University, that runs to 80 pages, with qualitative analysis of 40 women, which, all allege that have had problems with masculine boisterousness. I mean, just
while you're finding your place, I'll pop in.
Yeah.
I've read that report. It's it's a wonderful waste of paper. I too, to my shame, printed it. And yes, it is long, but it doesn't say very much. If you ask people to whine about pretty much anything, you'll find 40 women. I think the more important are the sort of indicators like rape on campus, which give a real indication of whether, as the left says, certain sorts of cultures and art have this power to make people sexist or make people violent. It used to be the old religious right who would say that particular things in sort of cultures in society or art on TV or whatever needed to be banned or censored because they made people behave in immoral and socially unproductive ways. Now it's the left. The left wants to ban certain video games. It wants to censor comic books, to go back and retroactively add transgender characters to comic books in the name of diversity, and ban books with ban stuff with too much violence or sexism, because it says that violence and sexism can shape who people are. The science on that, frankly, is very much out. In the case of video games, for example, there's some evidence that violent video games make people nicer. This report, cherry picks a bunch of whinging, which you could just as easily have done the other way around, and doesn't take into account any of the, if it had any integrity, it would have taken into account the fact that many of the statistics and memes that we hear about, this 1 in 5, 1 in 6 women on campus, who get sexually assaulted, just bears no relation to reality and isn't true. And if they wanted to really find out the truth behind any of these things, they would have been intellectually honest. It is one of the most purposefully disingenuous pieces of research I've read in a very long time, which, I'm sure they've all got very bright futures in the Labour Party, but it's not a particularly interesting work of scholarship.
You're not saying that Labour is left, do you, or that somehow that Labour is left? Because
I'm sort of getting
if you do,
I'm getting the impression that you probably think Cuba's is sliding into neoliberalism. I don't know, but I'm just making a.
So, Milo, why do you think that people see lad culture as detrimental then? What would you say?
Well, people, as I said, there's an impression now that some of the male virtues are somehow wrong or faulty, or that are things that we should not aspire to. Boys are judged against feminine standards in schools and then drugged up when they don't comply to them. Is it 1 in 6, 1 in 7 American kids is on Ritalin? I mean, it's horrifying statistics. We're drugging an entire generation of boys, and lots of people have written about this over the last 20 years. Later on in society, as they get older, men are punished for other male virtues too. The fact is that it's easy for us to sit around and have a spirited intellectual debate about these things. So society requires and relies on many of these male virtues: competitiveness and physical aggression and strength. I mean, the studio we're sitting in was built by men. You don't see many women queuing up to drive oil trucks or lay bricks or be what are those guys called in the skies who polish windows 60 floors up. Women don't want to do those jobs, and the entire physical environment around us is built by men, and yet we constantly whinge about these virtues that men have.
There's no way that we could ever agree on things, Milo. I mean, I do not understand I do not accept there is such a thing as a masculine virtue. I mean, are you saying that there's no competition between women? That is to say, you suggest
I'm saying women are prone to the same degree of competitiveness that men are.
So, I mean, why is competitiveness, competition, a masculine? Why do you define it as a masculine virtue?
Well, because it seems to predominantly happen in men. So I call it a masculine virtue. I don't know whether there's a biological reason for that, but I don't think it's something that many people would seriously disagree with. That men tend to have this sort of obsessive, competitive aggressive thing in them that most women don't. I don't think that's a.
So do you think there's a biological base for that? Because if
Maybe,
there is,
I don't know.
Well, there isn't.
Well, you say that. Of course, you would say that. I have no idea. Maybe. I mean, there are books coming out now that suggest that, contrary to consensus of academics, there is a biological basis for race, and possibly.
But who writes those books? Aren't they academics?
Well, the ones that the person who wrote that book was the former science correspondent of the New York Times, which is not somewhere you would ever imagine somebody coming from and writing that there's a biological basis to race. So I think the fact is that nobody really knows. You say there isn't, like you could know. You don't know. We don't have the foggiest idea about the genome. We've only just started mapping it. It's only been the last 10
what
years
I'm trying to say,
that we've had the computer processing power to even work out, where people come from in the world based on DNA samples. You cannot possibly know any of the things you're asserting.
What I'm trying to say is, to return to Pallier, is that Pallier does have a very strong sort of argument when it comes to the way things were, and this is no question. She starts from the ancient times, and of course, there is a case in which it can be supported, that it can be argued rather, that men used to be a lot more competitive, all these things that you describe as masculine virtues or whatever. Mm-hmm. But this is not the case anymore. And are you saying that for the last 20 years there's been a way of inverting this social schema, and now we have to turn back because it's not doing our society any good?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying the competitiveness and obsession of men, which shows itself in their preponderance in certain subjects, universities, and certain professions, has put us on the moon. It built the pyramids, it built cities, it built the internet. Men did that, and part of the reason they did that is these what I call the masculine virtues.
But of course, I mean, if that's the way to that men did all that, men did other things too.
Yes, men do terrible things too.
World wars, Holocaust,
this is the problem with men. If you the IQ distribution graph, which you'll know about, of course, there are more sublime geniuses, but also more knuckle draggers. This is why men are all the great artistic geniuses in history, with very few exceptions. But they also fill all the prisons. This is the double-edged sword of being a man. But to say that it's somehow better, women tend to cluster around the mean as far as IQ goes. So if you get 50 men and 50 women, the sort of average amount of IQ will be the same. But most women cluster around that 100, and men, you get more, as I say, more geniuses and more knuckle draggers. But the point is that those men at the top, and there are fewer women simply because of the way that IQ is distributed, are the ones who really push us up.
That there is a case in which the women have got, how can I put it, middle-brow IQs, and then when it comes to men, they've got high-brow IQs.
The suggestion from IQ distribution and G distribution as well, and they're not perfect measures, but they're pretty good indicators of some things. The suggestion from those distribution graphs is that the male graph is shallower, so you get more men with IQs of over 160 than you get women, right? So the female graph is taller because
why
more
do
women
you trust
cluster
this kind of research and not the other kind of research?
The
kind of research is produced here, for instance.
Well, I think when you see something that runs contrary to all the evidence of your senses and experience, you have to question it more carefully. And this piece of research, which is fear-mongering and incredibly, obviously and transparently politically motivated. Yes, I do approach that with skepticism. Whereas if I read in a science textbook about IQ distribution, I'm much more likely to take it at face value. But the interesting thing about these debates is that you're not allowed to have them. The president of Harvard had to resign for talking about intelligence distribution in boys and girls, for making one joke in a speech. This is one of the greatest academic institutions in the world. Just to give you an indication of how dysfunctional this debate has become, he had to resign merely for alluding to it, and that's why it takes gay guys to stick up for boys.
Okay, Theo, do you see lad culture as a renewed form of sexism, would you say?
If lad culture is what I perceive it to be, then I do, of course. Milo has not yet described at what point, I suppose, men stop being boisterous and are being downright offensive.
Men are pigs. Yeah. Men are pigs. But there's nothing necessarily, but that doesn't mean that we should ban them from things or pathologise their behaviour or shame them publicly.
I wouldn't say pathologise, but
that's exactly what happens when we put them on drugs. How else do you describe it when you put a generation of young boys on Ritalin? If you put a generation of young boys on Ritalin, what are you doing besides pathologising them being boys?
Listen, they're putting boys on Ritalin not because they don't want them to be women, as it were, because there are no structures and support out there there to deal with students or with young pupils who are really problematic.
It's not the problem.
They don't want to turn them into women.
No, that's absolutely not the case. The problem is that the misbehaviour, problematic behaviour, has been redefined so broadly that it basically encompasses all boys.
Well, as I said, I don't agree. I'm an educator, yes, and I've got.
And as an educator, you must realise there is something wrong with a system that puts whatever it is, 20%, 10%, any double-digit statistic of its young people on drugs. I don't agree with your point that this is done because in order to somehow roughen up the edges of, how can I put it, of men who otherwise they would be too feminine, as it were. But what I do, where I do have a problem with when it comes to the statistics, is that 27%, according to this report, 27% of women have been harassed, according to what they perceive as harassment. Yes.
If they perceive it as harassment, then it is harassment.
No, it's not. Absolutely not.
Let me just finish. And what happens is this: that when, as an educator, when I translate that into numbers, that means that 15 of my female students, my women students, this year have been harassed in my class.
But it's not true. It's not true. These women have been told that harassment is, is so broadly defined they can claim anything. Look at this false rape claim after false rape claim after false rape claim in the media all the time.
I mean, Sussex suffers over there, in that little.
Well, the Duke Lacrosse scandal. There were 5 since, and then last week the Jackie at the University of Virginia, a whole fraternity still on suspension. No punishment for her. No punishment for the journalists who falsely repeated a totally fantastical claim of rape. Which indicates to us where people are defining sexual harassment and what women think they can get away with. I mean, if you start this with the presupposition, which I find incredibly patronising and offensive to women, that all women are victims, and that these women.
Nobody's saying that.
Well,
I'm saying that
if you start from that position, you're incapable of seeing women as the bad actors in some of this, and they are. And very often, women claim harassment where there was none. And very often, women say, "I feel harassed," which is effectively meaningless.
What I'm trying to say is, I don't place them as victims or as potential victims. The only thing I'm taking as my canon, as it were, is the fact that 27% of women say that they feel to have been harassed. Now, if they feel they have been harassed, then are you saying that they're doing it because they want to get away with it, or that they want to feel important?
I'm saying that they need to grow up. What I'm saying,
and do what? Allow men to say things to them, touch them?
Not use their sexuality as a weapon, which many of them are. They get approached by men who are already incredibly timid about approaching them at all. There are all these new rules about how men are allowed to relate to women. Nobody ever tells boys these rules. These boys don't know. They go up, they might ask a girl out. I mean, you're talking about statistics from the sort of place that says that unwanted sexual approaches constitute harassment. That's in that definition. Well, you'd have to close down nightclubs if you don't want that to happen anymore. A man approaching a woman and being rebuffed. In my mother's generation, the woman would have said, "Get lost." Today, she's off to the guidance counsellor's office and filing a sexual harassment claim. And the only difference between the men that she says yes to and the men she says no to are whether she's sexually attracted to them. Sexual harassment these days is being defined as whether or not the woman is interested in the man. So, obviously what happens is the ugly, unattractive guys who hit on women and get turned back get accused of sexual harassment. It isn't sexual harassment asking someone out.
I think,
within that definition is unwanted advances. That's not harassment.
Now, listen.
Harassment is what Bill Clinton does, grabbing intern's hands and putting it on his erect penis. I don't see much of that going on in campus.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. I mean, this is sort of there's so many things wrong with what you've said to me. I don't know where to start. You said to me, first of all, you said to me that women use their sexuality as a weapon.
Yes, I think some of them do.
Some of them. How many?
Well, I don't,
the
problem is, if you define harassment as whatever somebody feels harassment to be, you'll never be able to answer any of those questions.
Well, listen, if you're saying that women use their, how can I put it, their sexuality as a weapon, this is a statement of fact which demands more scrutiny, which you're not able to give at the moment.
Well, fine. Although the dozens of fake rape cases on
at the same time
on campuses, there's your example.
At the same time, let me give you another, pose another question, if I may. I saw the other day a little. Those things that onesies that young babies wear, and they're literally for young babies. Now, one of them
adults style now.
Do they? Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know any of them. Anyway, so there were sort of onesies, and there was the pink one for the young girl was bore the logo "I hate my thighs," whereas for the blue one for the young boy was "I'm a superhero." Can you not see anything valid there?
Okay, first of all, that wasn't the complete range. So you're cherry picking You're cherry picking You're cherry picking. That wasn't the complete range.
I don't care about the range.
The worst example of this, the best example of that, on some onesie that if you want to get your
something like that.
This story came from the Daily Mail, so it's nice at least to know that you read a diverse.
I did not read it on the Daily Mail.
No, you may not. Well, somebody rewrote it then, but it's nice to have it. Nice to hear you're taking the Daily Mail's reporting seriously, but it isn't serious reporting. That's just a ludicrous, ridiculous example.
I didn't read the report. Just as take it as face value. You've got two at the moment when say. Gender performance is created, if you like. A woman is characterized as one who should always feel guilty for her body.
No, I think women are encouraged to look good because men are visual animals, and if women want to get the best boyfriend, they have to look good. That's because men are, we like women who look good. Women like men who make them laugh, and we go for different things in the different sexes. The sexes are not identical, and if men, are visual animals and like to look at, women who look good. So women who want the best possible boyfriend are going to diet and are going to work out. I don't find that to be dysfunctional.
Are you saying that women don't have to work out on or with?
I'm saying there aren't the same pressures. Yeah, I mean there aren't the same. There are now. I mean we have this sort of weird metrosexual culture in the last generation. Partly as a function of what I've been talking about. Men no longer know what their place is. This sort of homosexualization.
I don't know. I think I've lost it entirely. I mean, there's, as I said, there's so many things that I don't agree with the otherwise.
So if we're going to bring it back to lad culture, would you say that it was a gender performance?
It is a performance, for sure. It is a performance. One that I find, as I said at the beginning of this debate, that's got really complex sociocultural and socioeconomic roots, and of course it is pernicious, and of course it is a problem. And I think, as I said, I couldn't believe if you'd said to me when I was an undergraduate that in the 21st century, in 2015, I would be debating, these issues with a man who's with another man. Then I would say to you that there's no way.
I can't agree that this stuff is intrinsically pernicious at all. I think some people behave badly to characterise this whole generation of young boys as pernicious and in need of fixing.
I don't. Not the boys.
I find that really troubling. And it sort of proves my point about boys getting pathologised and being held up to feminine standards. This is pernicious and it needs to be fixed, which is both what you're saying and the message of this report too. From the executive summary right through to the last page. We've got to do something about these men. The fact is that being on a university campus is one of the safest places you can be.
Of course.
It's one of the safest places you can be. Would you agree then that, for example, the incident of violent sexual assault, like serious stuff, I'm not talking about, somebody brushing up against a breast in a bar, who cares? I'm talking about...
I don't think the women care either. I mean...
Well, they do, because they complain to people like this, but they've been taught they can use it afterwards. They don't care at the time, but they've been taught they can use it afterwards.
I don't know.
Do you agree that violent sexual assault on campus is much lower than the general population?
I wouldn't know. I would not know.
You wouldn't know.
I would not know.
Because what we're expected to believe is that it's much higher, right? We're expected to believe that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, depending on who you believe, women is has a serious problem at campus. This stuff just isn't true, and so much of this debate is driven by stuff that isn't true. And if you believe all this stuff and you think, well, I guess it's all right, people have looked into this, then of course you get the idea there's some sort of problem with boys, but there isn't. There isn't a problem with boys on campus. The only problem really
Milo,
is the other way around.
I mean, honestly, if a young woman says she has a problem with a certain kind of behaviour, then there is a problem. No ways.
It may just be a problem with her. You have to accept the possibility that her complaint does not have merit. You cannot define sexual assault or harassment as purely the feelings of the victim. You just can't, because they can be wrong, or it could have been a misunderstanding. I mean, this is the whole point of this sort of these fake rape charges, that are drunken fumbles that end up in a lawsuit. People can be wrong, and they very often are.
I'm not saying that there are no such things,
of adolescence, alcohol, and all of those other things. There are misunderstandings. There are sex that neither person really wanted to do. This stuff, is the sort of stuff that shapes you. This is the sort of stuff that it's a bit shitty at the time, but it's not. It doesn't traumatise you for the rest of your life. And people who claim it does are out to get something.
As I'm saying, I'm not saying that I don't seek to pathologise men. I do not seek to pathologise boisterousness. I do not seek to pathologise, to use an older phrase, sort of sowing one's oats, as it were. That's not the problem. The problem is when that becomes offensive and presumption. This is
your standard of offence is so absurdly low that certainly I'd be guilty of it on a daily basis. It just makes me think, well, what do you want done to these boys? You say if this is a problem, then presumably you want them punished, or
I don't.
You want some
I just
sort of
want
sanctions.
To stop. What I'm trying to say is
stop doing what?
Okay,
stop making women feel offended. Good luck with that.
But to invert this question of yours, what do you want to do with these women? Luckily, I'm a man. I've done fall prey to these things. I'm never going to be asked whether I feel safe. The very fact that you have to actually raise the question.
I think that's in itself sexist. But you're saying you're a man, you'll never have to feel unsafe.
No, what I'm trying to say.
That's just rubbish.
So, Milo, would you say then?
That's sexist.
Could a man say that he'd been harassed by a woman?
Of course, men are harassed by women all the time. We just don't want to hear about it. There's a phenomenon there is a whole sort of dark, unspoken about phenomenon of women raping men.
Just this question, if you didn't mind. So, you asked me, what do I want to do with these boys? Yes, pathologise them, punish them, or whatever. What do you want to do with these women, young women who say they feel uncomfortable?
Send them away with a book by one of the feminists of the 60s who said,
like who?
Don't go, well, I do like Camille Paleo. I think she, her argument is quite compelling. If you cover these girls in cotton wool in university, when they go out into the real world, they are at such high risk of something really serious happening to them. What I would like to tell these girls is very straightforward.
Misread Paglia. Paglia talks about conflict. She does not apportion who is right and who is wrong. She's saying that the relationship between the gender relationships, for hundreds of years, millennia, in other words, has been one of conflict. Now,
yes.
The thing is this: that we don't live in this. Luckily, we have advanced from the stage where we would club a woman, and then drag her into your cave, so to speak. Luckily, we have advanced from that. So, do you want us to return to that?
No, but what I'm saying is, what she says is that men are violent and dangerous. That is wrapped up as essential to male sexuality. It's what women find attractive about men. They like the bad boys. They like dangerous men. It is an integral part of all of the best sex. Is a frisson of danger. It's such an essential part of who we are. I kind of feel like you want to stamp all of that out, and you want to neuter boys. Look what's happened.
No.
Look what's happened. A generation of metrosexuals that no woman wants to settle down with because he uses up more shelf space in the bathroom than she does.
Metrosexuals are not dangerous, or
no, and that's the problem. That's why no women want them. That's why they're all single.
Yeah, that's
why they're all single.
That says a lot more about them than women.
No, it doesn't. It says that women don't want them. It says women don't want them because they've turned themselves into feminized men. As the lady in Hamilton would have said, gay men in all but the sex, right? The sorts of men who read GQ, which is a gay magazine for men who happen to have sex with women, right? This is a generation of men we've bred, and they're not very interesting. They're not very exciting. None of them's going to accomplish great things, and women don't want them. And I don't want this next generation of young boys to be even more screwed up than that. And in answer to your question about what we do with these women, we take them into an office, we shake them, and say, "Stop it. Grow up. If you don't like it, turn around and tell him where to fucking go." Excuse my language. If you don't like it, tell him where to go and get on with your life. Don't, wander in the next day to some sort of committee, report him for sexual harassment, report him to the police.
I don't think they do that, Milo. I don't think the women who actually say they have been harassed or actually... Are you saying that now women don't just tell men where to go instead of which to say, "Oh, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go tomorrow and I'm going to report you to campus."
Of course they do. There are women's officers on every university campus that practically coach people into making false rape reports. That sounds incredibly conspiratorial, but look what actually happens. Look at how many of these things fall apart under scrutiny because a woman was told if after the event she changed her mind about the whole scenario.
It doesn't fall apart under scrutiny. It falls apart because there is an victimization. Women are supposed to. If I were a young woman who, say, had been harassed or raped, so to speak, do you think with the current societal structure we have, I would go the next day and report it to the law?
They do.
Do you know how many such crimes get unreported?
I can't remember how many, tens of thousands, but I have no idea.
So there are women who don't report because they feel ashamed. Because they feel they actually brought it on themselves.
Of course.
Because they might have thought by people like you that they use their sexuality as a weapon.
We've got to stop making rape this thing that takes over the rest of your life. I mean, it
don't
doesn't
want
have to.
And
it starts at university. When you tell these women that if you feel offended, you are offended. And you have every right to get somebody to go and rap him on the knuckles and say, "Don't behave like that to women." When they get out into the wider world, they get raped. Because they have no idea how to deal with men. They have no idea how to operate in the real world. They have no idea how to, be a woman and survive amidst, dangerous, violent male sexuality. Of course it is. That's what's so great about it. But it also makes it dangerous, and women need to know how to navigate that and to keep themselves safe. They will never learn if you keep them in cotton wool and say that if someone looks at you wrong and you feel harassed, then that's harassment.
If you argue that there is an inherent, innate form of male sexuality that is dangerous and can be how can I put it can be dangerous for women, then there's a problem.
There's no problem unless there's an act of violence committed. It's not a problem if people are just being loud and boisterous and a bit gobby in a bar. That's not a problem. What I'm saying is that there are rapists out there who are way off the deep end, who are out there to hurt women, and there are a few of them. And women need to know.
But you said earlier, just now, you said that women, get out of university, they graduate university, and then being mollycoddled in university, as it were, and then they go out and they get raped because they don't know how to handle men.
They will do if they don't know how to look after themselves, and they won't learn how to look after themselves if there's always a university committee to report a black look to. It's just ridiculous.
Can I just, if you didn't mind, okay, if you argue that men have been destroyed or have been deprived of their primordial, if you like, danger and drive or sort of violence or whatever. So if they have been destroyed, how is it that when they actually leave university, they pose a risk to women?
I'm talking about generational trends. I'm saying young boys are having it beaten and drugged out of them. Right, I'm saying this is but that's why. So
you're saying that in 10 years' time we're not going to have any rape?
Who knows? I mean, rape statistics are going down, not going up as people like to claim. I mean, the number of rapes in universities is plummeting. The number of reports is going up, but you talk to police officers and they'll tell you we can't say this in public.
I don't talk to police.
The number of all crimes is going down in this country at the moment. Everything's going down. The general trajectory on every crime except I think. Some white collar thing, and there are about 2 crimes that are going up at the moment.
Milo, so what do you think a woman's role is in today's society then?
I think that it's a lot broader than it used to be, which is a good thing, and it's great.
So she asked you what should be. Sorry.
Well, I don't think there's an answer to that really. I think women should have the opportunity to do whatever they want to do. What I do think is important though is that we don't try to. I believe in equality of opportunity, but not of outcome, right? So it's important to give women equal access to everything. whether it's promotions, pay, education. What we should be wary of doing is imposing arbitrary quotas which don't reflect the choices that women make. So, for example, there's some evidence to suggest that in more equal societies, women's educational choices actually narrow. In places like Pakistan, you get like 50-50 women on science courses, so STEM subjects. You go somewhere like Norway, and it drops down to about 5%. And in more equal societies, fewer women choose to do those things because they don't have to. They have every option available to them, and they don't choose to go into those subjects. If we then try to sort of impose arbitrary quotas in the jobs and professions that come after those subjects, we risk distorting all sorts of things in an unhealthy and unnecessary way. I would say women obviously should have access to everything. They bring enormously valuable contributions to business, to government, to all sorts of things. I mean, having a woman in the room at meetings that were I've been in meetings that in companies that were previously all men. Putting a woman in the room transforms the room infinitely for the better. I would welcome all of that stuff. The only caveat I have is that I see some industries, like the tech industries, the startup and technology industry, sort of hand-wringing, killing themselves over why there are so few women. The answer to that broadly is simply that women don't want to do those jobs. They don't want, when you need to put your Gladwell 10,000 hours in your 20s, they don't want to be stuck behind a computer coding. So my only worry is, we don't get into a situation where we are doing positive discrimination, affirmative action, arbitrary quotas, all that kind of stuff. Let women do whatever they want. And if women primarily go into the healthcare professions and tend to leave science alone, who cares?
Do you think that men and women are equal?
Yes, of course. I mean, there are differences in the sexes, certainly. There are differences in what the sexes choose to do with their lives. There are physical differences. Men tend to be bigger and stronger. There are the biological things we cannot get away from. There's no point getting into sort of academic
scrutiny.
No. Jumping through sort of weird, contorted logical hoops to try and claim there's no biological difference between men and women. Of course there is. But there are differences, but they should be treated entirely equally.
Sorry.
Yeah, what would you say?
What was the question? Sorry.
Would you say that men and women are equal in terms of?
Yes, of course. Of course there are, but I do have an enormous problem with the way in which, pardon me, I think is a really facile, impoverished way of actually saying women choose to do. Women, the profession that women choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is extraordinarily problematic. It suggests that somehow there is some sort of coding that takes place at some point, either pre-birth or immediately after birth, that programs, as it were, women into choices. And that, of course,
what I'm saying is that men and women are different, and those different aptitudes and tendencies and abilities and habits naturally are going to shape the sort of jobs they want to do later. Men, with their sort of obsessive, autistic competitiveness, end up in things like astrophysics and maths and philosophy. Makes sense. Women, nurturing and communicative and all these other things we associate with women very often end up in healthcare professions and that sort of thing. I don't see anything intrinsically wrong with that. They're both necessary components of a free and equal society, and there's no problem, there's no reason why we should be worried about different sexes choosing different career paths.
For women who actually go into philosophy or women who go into...
No, of course not. There's nothing wrong with male nurses. No, we should give everybody the opportunity to enter whatever the hell field they want. But that doesn't mean that we should worry if a field is particularly dominated by women. I mean, you don't see people complaining that let's get more men into social work. It's only ever done when it's men, and these aren't always necessarily the most prestigious jobs. I mean, some of them are quite well paid, but they're not always very prestigious jobs. They're quite often sort of effectively jobs for basement dwellers, and yet we still complain about it because it's men. In the female-dominated industries, there is no such complaint, and I find that a bit weird.
Okay, so finally, Theo, would you say that lad culture is something to be concerned about at university?
As I said, if there are women out there, and I know there are, who feel harassed, threatened, or in any way their behaviour compromised, or by lads and by blokes and so on, then of course there is a problem. And I don't think the world, the current problems of the world are far bigger problems the world has at the moment than what we're discussing, and of course has nothing to do with radical feminism, as such. The problem of the world is inequality, is not radical feminism.
Okay, and finally, Milo, what do you think women think about lad culture?
I think, as with all these issues, there is a very level-headed, sensible, common sense majority who think, I would be conceited to say, pretty much like me. They don't see this as a sort of terrible, awful situation. They don't actually perceive a lot of the damage that's being done at the moment, a lot of the problems that are surfacing, the sort of rift between the sexes. They don't see a lot of that, they just have to deal with the results. They don't always know where it's come from. But I don't think that, if I think through the women in my life, and the women I admire, and the women that I, have learned from, the thought of any of them running off to a campus staff member, or running off to the police because somebody brushed their tit in a bar, it would be absurd to them, the very suggestion of it. And I think they would cringe in embarrassment for their sex at the sort of women who complain effectively over nothing, and would also agree with me that defining harassment as whatever makes someone feel harassed is such an absurdly broad and useless definition that of course it's going to generate whatever statistics you ever want to show about bad behaviour from one side.
Okay, so would either of you like to add anything else to this debate? You've got any final points?
Not really. As I said, we can be talking for hours. Perhaps next time we can get a few drinks in Zua, and we too can be a bit boisterous. But I
wouldn't want you to take you back to your roots.
But the thing is that I don't find my saying that when one feels harassed, whatever makes one feel threatened or harassed or in any way, in danger, that's a ridiculous thing to say, because
well, they're quite
because
different
that
things,
goes that's what you just said. It's not just about sexuality or gender that we can apply this rubric. If I were a black person, if I were if I were discriminated against because of my ethnic background, if you thought that by calling me a stinking Greek, for instance,
feelings is not a way to adjudicate this. I wouldn't say this, but I could say that seeing black people in the street makes me feel edgy and uneven and uneasy, and I go to check my wallet is still there. That's the sort of thing a bigoted person might say. They might say they felt in physical danger. According to your definition, they're perfectly entitled to do so. And we should do something about it. No, they're bigots, they're wrong. Like these women who say they're being harassed with no justification, no basis, who just need to grow up. They're wrong.
So can I ask you something? If, say, somebody from UKIP said, a UKIP fellow, said that I don't belong here because unfortunately I'm not British biologically, yes? I may take umbrage to that and say I'm offended and I want something to be done about it. Another person would say, nothing wrong with that, grow up. Would that be?
Well, I think the whole problem with this is the offence taking in the first place. You would be. There are things you'd be right to be offended about, and there are things you would not be right to be offended about. What I'm saying is that there are, in the case of.
No, I think you're wrong here. If you're offended by something, if somebody say,
if we operate society on the basis of hurt feelings, we're going to get ourselves into very well. We're going to see a society that looks like Twitter, and I don't think that's what anybody wants.
I don't really. I don't really where that came from.
Unfortunately, we need to wrap this up now, but please join the debate on Twitter with the hashtag #TheLadDebate.
Oh, Twitter.
Thank you for joining us.